Well, we're just back.
Yeah, I'll say we are.
Jeez, what a journey. Depot days in Cheyenne, Wyoming.
Yes.
That is one of certainly the best train shows anywhere. There's some good train shows, don't get me wrong, but it's almost in a way a Denver show. Because most of the people who come up there come up from Denver, and there's so many great train shows in Denver and in the Denver area. But this one has the advantage of having the big boy.
I know.
And,
what a big boy he is.
The Union Pacific, it's strictly off limits. They don't let anybody out there in the locomotive shops, certainly, when they're, working where they're restoring the big boy and rebuilding that. But this one time a year, they open up the shops for the train show for depot days, and they give tours of the shops and let people see the 844 and, more significantly, the restoration work on the big boy. And of course, they've got a great train show going on. It's the Sherman Hill Railroad Club, and they have the Sherman Hill Model Railroad Show.
Right.
Which is those guys doing their train show. So anyway, check this out. It's really cool. Well, of course, the primary attraction at Depot Days is engine 4014, the big boy. It's so darn cool that they were able to grab one of these 8 surviving big boys, this one out of Pomona, California, and bring it to Cheyenne to start restoration on it.
My first experience seeing this, although I'd heard about it, was your first video, your series, when it was moving down the tracks from Pomona, and it actually moved me to tears.
Kind of moved me to tears, too. I was just so amazed to see one of these things back on the tracks again. Words just fail me to try to describe what it's like to be in the presence of one of these beasts.
Yeah, it's so big. I mean, the size of it alone is just awe-inspiring, but a little intimidating, too.
These big boy locomotives were built at the very end of the age of steam, and so they sort of represent the perfection of what a steam engine should be.
At 1.2 million pounds, it's one of the world's largest locomotives.
Yeah, this one they found in Pomona at the LA County Fairgrounds. And it was brought here to Cheyenne, Wyoming, where the Union Pacific keeps their surviving steam engines, most notably our favorite engine, 844.
I love seeing the 844 roll into Pocatello, Idaho, my old stomping grounds.
That was a fun day. When they first brought the big boy here, it was really in horrible condition. But they tore into it, starting restoration. They're going to try to have this guy completely finished for the Union Pacific's 150th anniversary, May 10th, 2019. Boy, do they have a lot to get done over the next 9 months if they're going to pull that off. But they very quickly got the engine dismantled and started rebuilding all of the necessary parts that they're going to need. And as of now, they have everything they need, and they're starting to put it back together. The 1,200-pound gorilla in the room is this, the boiler.
The most massive part of this whole restoration has been restoring that boiler.
Part of what Ed's been up against is that since steam locomotives are sort of obsolete, the Union Pacific had thrown away a lot of the equipment that he needed to rebuild this. This is his new overhead crane that he was showing off. In this case, it's just an 80-ton crane. The original crane was 4 times that capacity, so they're using those screw jacks you see on either corner of the boiler to lift the boiler, as the new crane can't actually lift the whole locomotive. The old one could.
That would be something to see, an entire big boy being lifted by a crane. Wow.
Between all of the old and new equipment, they now have every machine tool they need to rebuild a steam locomotive. These are the pan brakes capable of bending 1-inch thick sheet steel to build the boiler out of. Also very massive lathes and milling machines. And they have a CNC machine room here, which really comes in handy when making all of these stay bolts. This is Fireman Ted. Normally he would be sitting in the fireman's seat when they're running the engines, but right now they're assembling the engine instead.
If all this was smaller and brass, we could just turn it over to Hendrickson for assembly.
A lot of things have been sent out for rebuilding, and they're all arriving back at the shops now, ready to be assembled. But the lion's share of this rebuilding is being done by the crew right here in the Cheyenne shops.
We saw a great presentation on how they refinished this cylinder.
And Ed's going to be putting that presentation up on their web channel here pretty soon, and we will post a link to that as soon as that's available. You really want to check that out. This is fascinating how they do this. Ed is showing us here the slide valve. Of course, the locomotive has 4 of these, but this massive piece of machining is just the slide valve for the 4 cylinders.
This little area here is called the steam edge. So that dimension was
And all of these linkages had to be remanufactured too.
and machine washers on either side of the valve and adjust the valve.
This is the framework for the rear engine, and that's been all cleaned up, painted, and ready to receive the wheels. And while we were there, all 8 axles were arriving from Strasburg, Pennsylvania, where they've been reworked and new tires put on them. It's quite an amazing process how these outer rings of metal, the tires, are put onto the wheel. First they have to be machined, of course, and those little spots that you see right there are burn marks because they actually mount the tire by putting a ring of fire around that rim. That expands the tire, and then it can be slid onto the wheel, and as it contracts, it locks in place. Hard to imagine that the millions of pounds of train are pulled by this friction joint. We've got to get ourselves to Pennsylvania.
Especially Strasburg.
Oh man, what a museum, and maybe we'd be lucky enough to see something like this. Over here, they're rebuilding the cab of the locomotive. That's coming right together. This is actually a pretty simple process, but you know, it's got to get done. And in that same area, they're rebuilding the trailing truck that sits underneath the cab. That's part of the rear engine. The front truck is part of the front engine and is being rebuilt on the next track over.
Look at the massive size of these castings.
It's actually hard to wrap your head around. This is where the front engine will mount. It's being assembled on the next track over, and then it just slides under the boiler at this position. It's really a separate locomotive in its own right, roughly the same tractive effort as the Northern 844. But it's a separate unit that just goes under the front of the locomotive. They're converting the engine to run on fuel oil, and this is one of the new jets that mounts in the firebox for providing fuel oil to the firebox. This is the old tender, and it's set up to run coal, and what they're going to have to do is replace the coal bunker in here with a fuel oil bunker. It's a pretty good sized area, it holds a lot of coal, but now this will all be an oil tank. Fortunately, they don't really need to get this ready for May 10th because they have a spare. They already converted one of these for the Challenger. After restoring the Challenger in 1991, they realized that they were going to have to run it on oil. The Big Boy's boiler is a very unique configuration. These are the boiler tubes, up here the flues, and they're only 22 feet long. At the front end of the locomotive is the smoke box, which contains 2 stacks, which are built entirely inside the smoke box. And this area up here is simply the water space, an area for expanding boiling water. The really unique feature on a big boy is the massive firebox. Look at that, over a third of the boiler, almost half, is just firebox, and we got to go inside. The firebox is actually bigger than my first apartment. It's over 200 square feet in here, 150 feet just of grates for burning the fire. But on close inspection, they found a lot of thin areas and a tremendous number of stay bolts that had failed. Here you can see how stay bolts work. As the pressure pushes in on the firebox and out on the outside of the boiler, that pressure is equalized by placing a bolt between those two surfaces. So the firebox is completely surrounded by a couple of thousand stay bolts, and they tend to fail. They're under a lot of pressure and they will snap. These numbers designate the style of stay bolts. There's something like 1,700 different sizes of stay bolts in this firebox. And many of those are flexible stay bolts. They have a ball joint at one end so that they can move as the boiler expands and contracts. And that looks like this when they're installed. The head of the stay bolt looks sort of like a round-headed screw with a cap welded over that. Now, in some areas, the metal itself has failed, and that has to be repaired by welding, as you can see here. And in some areas, an entire section of metal will have to be replaced. These are failed stay bolts, and you can see why hundreds of these needed to be replaced. This is what a brand new flexible stay bolt looks like. Now, in the end of the stay bolt, there's a hole, the telltale. If the stay bolt snaps, water will start leaking out of here. And once the bolt is in place, this tool is used to round the end of that stay bolt off, as you can see here. And then a small rubber plug is put in the telltale hole to keep dirt from getting in there. The flexible stay bolts then have a cap welded over the end of it to keep the steam pressure inside. All of this is built right here in the shops on the CNC lathe in the other room. Here you can see how the cap fits over the flexible stay bolt. Multiply this operation something like 2,000 times and you now have a rebuilt boiler. Now, the very bottom edge of the firebox is an area called the mud ring. You can see here it's only about 6 inches thick and it's filled with water, and it's held together just with simple rivets rather than stay bolts. One of the most unique features on a big boy is this area. This is part of the firebox where it tapers down and becomes round. This accelerates and compresses the gases in the firebox. These huge tubes overhead are cleanouts to get mud off the top of the firebox. There are a series of plugs in the side of the firebox which can be removed and then the crown sheet flushed. The rear flue sheet is mounted here at the front of this rounded section, and from here the boiler flues extend 22 feet forward all the way to the smoke box. Most of the boiling activity takes place in this area around the flues. There are also tubes inside these tubes, which are the superheater for superheating the steam. As this area of the boiler is perfectly round, no need for stay bolts, it's self-equalizing, just the giant rivets that hold the whole thing together. At the front of the locomotive is the gigantic smoke box containing 2 smokestacks. This is the location of the front flue sheet, and once the rest of the boiler is rebuilt, the tubes will be mounted between these 2 flue sheets and the ends expanded with a special roller machine that expands the tube, locking it into place and making it absolutely steam tight. The boiler flues also act as stays for the 2 flue sheets, equalizing the pressure front to rear. The entire front of the smoke box is a hinged door. It's necessary to be able to get in here to remove cinders and ash and all manner of debris. Also in this area, there was damage to the sheet metal, and that had to be repaired. The door is in pretty good shape, but as we can see here, it was replaced in 1956. It's not the original door.
We took the 90-minute drive down to the Forney Museum in Denver. I had to see just what one of these big boys actually looks like put together. It's one thing to see one in pieces like the one in Cheyenne, but to see this Goliath put together, it's just overwhelming. It's like a skyscraper laid on its side.
I can sort of equate this to standing next to the Queen Mary when we went and saw that at Long Beach Harbor. To see something of this size and you're standing next to it, and it's just really overwhelming.
After seeing this one, all together, so to speak, I don't know what those guys felt like in Cheyenne when they got the big boy there and had to try to take that apart and put it back together.
I can't even begin to imagine how they felt approaching a project like this. This is one of the locomotives that Union Pacific looked at in terms of finding a locomotive that they could restore, but the one in Pomona turned out to be in much, much better shape. The guys down in Pomona had really done a good job of taking care of it. It's also really incredible to see the cab in this thing. It's unlike the cab of any locomotive I've ever seen before. Trying to figure out what the various controls do and how this whole thing operates. I'm sort of used to something like Dan's little engine that's pretty simple to understand, but this, it's like walking into the heating plant at a big building and trying to figure out what knob you turn to put heat onto the 15th floor. This is Ed's side of the locomotive, the engineer's side. Sort of recognize the control. This is Ed's view forward, which is to say no view at all. The engineer really has no idea. If they stick their head out the window, they can almost sort of see, but really you're driving blind when you're driving one of these things.
So this is Ted's side of the locomotive, or the fireman, and those are all the knobs and controls he has to watch over to keep the fire burning inside the boiler.
All of the Union Pacific steam locomotives have to be fitted with electronic controls for running diesel engines. Quite often they go out with a diesel engine to act as supplemental braking, and so you have to be able to run the diesel from the steam engine. I'll bet this is rather tricky, figuring out how to run the diesel and the steam locomotive together. Now you might be surprised to know that there are actually two big boy locomotives being restored in Cheyenne. 4004 here was placed in the park many, many years ago and is currently being cosmetically restored by our friend John Ramash with Wasatch Rail Contractors. We visited their shop last year on Depot Days and saw them rebuilding that locomotive, Klondike Kate, which is currently running at the Como Roundhouse in Como, Colorado. No way would a small shop like theirs be able to restore a massive engine like a big boy. To paraphrase Jaws, they would need to find a bigger boat. But they are replacing sheet metal and cleaning 404 up here. Should look pretty good when they get it done here in a year or so. Unfortunately, Holiday Park here was also intended to be used as something of a flood basin when needed, and on at least one occasion this poor locomotive was almost completely submerged in water. Needless to say, it'll never run again, but hopefully they can clean up some of the rust and get it looking good again. I guess it's not too surprising that of the 8 surviving big boy locomotives, 3 of them are pretty much all together here. After all, this was the home of the big boy locomotive at Cheyenne, Wyoming.
These are the sand domes or sand boxes, but look how big they are. I'm not a tiny person.
Speaking of tiny, the locomotive is protected by Rocky and his friends. Oh, look, your favorite thing, a caboose.
Yes, I can't think of a better office for rebuilding such a fun locomotive as a caboose.
And that's what John Ramash has done. He found an old Union Pacific caboose, mounted it on a trailer frame, and that's his construction office, and he can take it with him wherever he goes. Ramash, too, is facing a lot of failed stay bolts, but hey, he doesn't have to replace them. Where Ed and his crew are just overwhelmed by stay bolts.
So not only safety first, but quality, that's what they're aiming for.
The Union Pacific steam crew is taking this very seriously, and when they get this thing done, it's going to be one of the best locomotive restorations anyone has ever done.
I can't think of a more appropriate engine to do this on.
Well, if all goes according to plan, the locomotive here, 4014, will be back on the rails again, this time under its own power for the 150th anniversary of the Union Pacific. It will be traveling from Cheyenne to Ogden, Utah, and won't that be something to see? Well, that was Depot Days.
Oh, no kidding.
Is that spectacular?
No kidding.
That is the best train show all year. I don't know, because there's some really good ones. That's certainly high on the list, because how do you compete with a big boy locomotive? But just the modular railroads that were there are so spectacular. Well, if you haven't been over to the channel, do pop on over to the channel. And if you're not a subscriber, do subscribe.
Absolutely.
It does us good, and it helps everybody out. It keeps the world safe for democracy.
It does.
It leads to world peace and all kinds of wonderful
Sure
things.
does.
And it makes you cool. As soon as you click on the button, immediately sunglasses appear, and you're automatically cool and everything. So
Absolutely.
you want to do that. You want to subscribe.
Yes.
And the way to do that is with the blue button. You ready for the blue button?
Over my shoulder.
Right over there, the round, circular, newfangled blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this movie on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you here on Tuesday with the Collector's Attic. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.